Well, it appears, mi amigos, Zorro was needed again. These are the further adventures of Zorro by Johnston McCulley. Throughout a long summer day of more than 100 years ago, the high fog had obscured the flaming ball of sun, and the coast of Southern California had been bathed in a haze. Then came the night, the indication of a drizzle that did not materialize, for the bank of fog suddenly was split as though with a sword, and the brilliant moon poured down, and the rising mist floated away to let the land be blessed with the brilliance and tossing sea dance in the silvery moonbeams. Approaching the shore came a sinister vessel, craft of ill omen. She sailed slowly under a spare spread of canvas, as though fearing to reach her destination too soon, and her lights were not burning. The hiss of waters from her bows was a lazy sort of hiss, but the more suggestive of that. It was the playful hiss of a serpent always ready to become enraged. Her appearance beckoned stealth and crime. She was low, rakish, and swift. No proper seaman commanded her, since her decks were foul and her sides were badly in need of protecting paint. But her sailing gear was in perfect condition, and the man at her helm could have told that she answered to her rudder like a love-sick maiden to her swain. Amidships stood her commander, one Barbados, a monstrous giant of a man with repugnant visage. Gigantic brass rings were in his mutilated ears. His eyes were pig-like, tiny, and glittering, wholly evil. His great gnarled hands continually were forming themselves into brutish fists. He wore no shirt, no shoes. His chest and back were covered with thick black matted hair. "By the saints," he swore in a voice that drowned the slush of waters against the vessel's side, "Sanchez, fools and devils! Is it necessary to shout to the world our villainy? Look at that flag flapping against the mast, 3 hours after set of sun, and the flag of the devil still flies. Discipline, huh!" "The flag," Sanchez bellowed. There was no definite order given, but the man nearest the mast was quick to lower the flag. Sanchez looked back towards Barbados, and Barbados grunted and turned away to look toward the distant land. Sanchez was a smaller edition of Barbados, the evil lieutenant of an evil chief. He was short and thick, and many a man had misjudged the strength of his shoulders and arms, and had discovered his sorry error too late. The eyes of Sanchez glittered also, first as he looked at Barbados, and then turned, as the chief had, to glance towards the distant land. A fair land it was, bathed in the mellow light of the moon. Along the shore uncertain shadows played like shapeless fairies at a game. And here was a darker streak where a canyon ran down to the sea, and a canyon with black depths caused by rank undergrowth and stubby trees. "There," Barbados bellowed. He pointed toward the mouth of the canyon, where the water hissed against the jumble of rocks. "We go ashore there, against the cliffs." Again there was no regular command, but the course of the pirate craft was changed a little, and she sailed slowly toward the spot Barbados had indicated. The chief grunted once more, and Sanchez hurried quickly to his side. "We land 20 men," Barbados commanded. 20 will be enough. I lead them, and you'll go with me. The others will remain aboard and take the ship offshore again, and return tomorrow night 2 hours before dawn. "See," Sanchez said. "'Tis to be a pretty party, by the saints. Rich loot, food, wines, honey, and olives, gold and jewels, and all sorts of precious stones. Bronze native wenches for such as like 'em. And time enough for it, huh? For some 4 miles we've sailed up and down the coast now, and then landing and raiding to get a few pigs and cows. 'Tis time for a bold stroke." "And this, it is arranged?" Sanchez questioned. "Am I in the habit of rushing in where things are not arranged?" Barbados demanded. "Senor Pirate, do you take me to be a weak and silly fool?" "If I did," Sanchez replied, I would have more wit than to say so to your face. Ha, it's arranged. When the governor's own man arranges it. There's a precious pair, the governor and his man, said Barbados, laughing raucously. Pirates and rogues we may be, but we can take lessons in villainy from some of the gentry who bear the names of caballeros but have foul blood in their veins. The thing has an evil look, Sanchez was bold enough to assert. I like not a task too easy, but my naked blade, that which looks easy often is not. If this should prove to be a trap. Barbados gave a cry of rage and whirled toward him suddenly, and Sanchez retreated a single step, and his hand dropped to the naked cutlass in his belt of tanned human skin. Try to draw it, fool, Barbados cried. I'll have you choked back in the face and hurled overboard for shark meat before your hand reaches that blade. I made no move to draw, Sanchez wailed. There are times when I wonder why I allow you to remain at my side, Barbados told him, folding his gigantic arms across his hairy chest. And there are times when I wonder whether your heart is not turning to that of a woman, your blood to water or swill. A trap, you fool. Am I the man to walk into traps? Kindly allow me to attend to the finer details of the business, and pretty business it is. The village of Reina de los Angeles is miles in the interior, Sanchez wailed. I do not like to get out of sight of the sea, with the pitching planks of a deck beneath my bare feet. Beware lest you have beneath your feet a plank that is walked until a man reaches its end and drops to a watery death, Barbados warned him. Enough of this. Pick the men who are to land and get ready the boats. An hour later the anchor had been dropped, and the pirate craft had swung with the tide and was tugging at her chains like a puppy on a leash. Over the sides went the boats, and Barbados growling soft curses at the noise his men made. We have nothing to fear, fools and devils, he said. But there will be no surprise if some converted native sees us and carries to Reina de los Angeles a word of our arrival. There is many in the hacienda in these parts where pirates are detested. Silence, rogues. You'll have your fill of noise tomorrow night. Without knowing it, Barbados practiced a deal of psychology. These wild men of the sea had before them a journey of some miles inland, and they knew it and hated it. But the pirate chief continually hinted to them of the rich loot at the end of the present trip, and his hints served their purposes well. Toward the shore they rowed, tossing in the breakers, making for the dark spot where the canyon ran down to the sea. There, a cliff some 12 feet high circled back into the land, forming a natural shelter against the land breeze at times and the sea winds at others. Through the surf they splashed, half naked, carrying naught except their weapons, and no weapons save their cutlasses. They gathered on the beach and watched the boats return to the ship, shrieking coarse jests at the men compelled to remain behind. Barbados took from his belt a tiny scrap of parchment and looked at it closely. With him this passed for a map. He called Sanchez to his side, turned his back to the sea, and looked along the dark reaches of the canyon. Forward, Barbados said, and let there be little noise about it. If we stumbled across one of them accursed native, slit his throat, and so silence it. And if we met a wandering fray of the mission, slit him into ribbons, Sanchez added, chuckling. To his wonder, Barbados grasped his arm so that Sanchez thought the bone might break. Enough of that, Barbados cried. Touch no fray and violence except if I give the word. You love robes and gowns? Sanchez asked in wonder. I love to protect myself, Barbados replied. It's an ill thing to assault a fray if it can be avoided. He stopped speaking for the moment and seemed to shiver throughout the length and breadth of his gigantic frame. I had a friend once who struck a fray, he added in a whisper. I do not like to remember what happened to him. Forward. Inland they tramped mile after mile, keeping to the canyons, following the arroyo now and then, dodging from dark spot to dark spot. While Barbados growled cusses at the bright moon, Sanchez continually admonished the men behind him to keep silent. It was a journey they disliked, but they liked to think of the loot they would find at the end of it. On they went toward the sleeping town of Reina de los Angeles. Besides Barbados and Sanchez, few of the men had seen the town. Pirates had been treated harshly there and when they had wandered inland. But now something had happened, it appeared, that made a raid on the town a comparatively safe enterprise. An hour before dawn, they stumbled across a native, caught him as he started to flee, and left his lifeless body behind. Then came the day, and they went into hiding in a jumble of hills with easy striking distance of the town. They had covered ground well. Sprawled on the sward they slept. Barbados, a little way aside, consulted his poor map once more, and then called Sanchez to his side. "Since we have to split up our force, it were well that you knew more of this business," he said. "I'm listening, Barbados." "This man who is meet us tomorrow night at the edge of town is a high official. I've heard you call him the governor's man. Even so, he is to have matters arranged so that the town will be at our mercy. It never has been raided properly. It will be necessary, perhaps, to steal horses and possibly a carreta or two in which to carry the loot. The town will be wide open for us, my friend. There is a presidio in Reina de los Angeles, and where there is a presidio, there are soldiers," Sanchez reminded him. "And where there are soldiers, there are fools," Barbados added. He stopped speaking long enough to chuckle. "I'm not afraid of soldiers. This man with whom we are to deal with will take care of the troops." "I fail to understand it," Sanchez said, shaking his head. "Why should such things be? Do we split the loot with this high official?" "Dream of innocence. Listen," Barbados hissed. "Listen and comprehend, else I choke you to death. An emissary came to me in the south from this high official, and through him arrangements were made. Things have happened since last we were in the vicinity of Reina de los Angeles. The governor, I know, left San Francisco de Asís and journeyed south with his gallant company, and while he was at Reina de los Angeles, something happened that caused him to hate the town. There even was talk for a time of him being forced to abdicate his high station." "Ha, more mystery," Sanchez growled. "It seems that in the Southland there was a pest of a highwayman known as Senor Zorro, and whom men called the Curse of Capistrano. A land pirate, spit upon him. How can a man be a pirate on the land? However, this Senor Zorro did several things worthy of note. From what I've heard, I would have had a dozen of him in my ship's company. We could raid the whole of Mexico and capture the Spanish fleets and attack Europe." "This Senor Zorro must be quite some man," Sanchez observed. "I have heard but little, but enough to convince me that I would have him for a friend rather than an enemy. He's sort of a devil. Now he's here, now he's gone. Like a ghost, he comes in like a specter and then disappears. Ha! You a pirate? Cross yourself." "I'm afraid of no live man who lives, save perhaps yourself," Sanchez observed, "but I like not this talk of ghosts." "Here's the jest, fool and friend. It develops after a time that this terrible Senor Zorro is nothing but a caballero out to have a bit of fun and protect the weak. There's a waste of time for you protecting the weak." And other sundry caballeros joined hands with him and punished minor officials who sought to steal and deal crookedly. That is right and proper. If a thief be a thief, if a pirate be a pirate, but do not play at being an honest man and try to be a thief and a pirate at the same time. "Ha," Sanchez grunted, meaning that he wished the sermon to end and the tale to continue. "This Senor Zorro, whose real name I've forgotten if I ever knew it, carved his initial with his sword into the cheeks and foreheads of many men. They call it the mark of Zorro. and when his identity was disclosed, his friends stood by him and told the governor that it was best if he returned to San Francisco de Asís and grace Reina de los Angeles with his continual absence. And did he? He did, Barbados replied, with hatred in his heart for this same Reina de los Angeles. He did not abdicate, of course, and he craves revenge. Ha, here is where we enter. It is, Barbados replied. We raid the town and take what we will, and the governor hears of it, sends soldiers running wildly up and down the coast, and winks at himself in his looking-glass. For the information and protection we get, we hand the governor's man at a certain time and place a certain share of the loot, which we can well afford since we are to get it so easily. If we forget to hand it, Sanchez began. Friend and fool, by the saints, are you an honest pirate or no? We shall deal fairly. Think of the future. It is not only Reina de los Angeles, there is San Juan Capistrano and rich San Diego de Alcala to come after that. By the time we have this pretty governor and certain of his officials in our mesh, and do as we will, what knaves. I would rather be an honest pirate than a politician any day. The day passed and dusk came, and once again Barbados indulged in curses, for it was a beautiful moonlit night, half as light as the day, and it had just died, and a man could be seen far away. But Barbados led his wretched company on toward the town, and after a time they came to a crest of a slope and saw the lights twinkling in the distance. Stretched on the ground so as not to form a silhouette against the sky, Barbados looked over the scene. He could see the plaza, fires burning before the huts of the natives, twinkling lights in the windows of the pretentious houses where lived the men of wealth and blood and rank. To one side was the Presidio, and to the other a church. Barbados grunted an order to Sanchez and crept forward alone. He approached the end of the village, reached the spot where the shadows were deep, and crouched to wait. For half an hour he waited, grumbling his impatience. Then there came to him a figure muffled in a long cloak. Barbados hissed a word that had been agreed upon. The figure stepped quickly to his side. "You are ready?" "Ready, senor," Barbados replied. "Where are your men?" "In hiding, 300 yards away, senor." "It were best to strike in about an hour. The soldiers will be sent toward the south on a wild goose chase." "I understand, senor. I drive back toward the hills to the hacienda to pay a social call. It would not do for me to be here, of course." "Certainly not, senor." "The way will be open to you. Take your will with this town, but do not use the torch except it be on the hut of some native. As soon as you have your loot, make for the sea again. The soldiers will be sent on a useless trail." "It's well arranged, senor. We'll strike as soon as the troopers are at a sufficient distance. There's something else. You must send a few of your men of force to the hacienda of Don Carlos Pulido, 3 miles to the north." "What is this, senor?" Barbados asked. "A little matter of abducting a woman for me." "Ha! The senorita Lolita Pulido, I understand. She is to be seized and conducted to the coast and taken aboard ship. She is not to be harmed, but treated with very special respect. In 4 or 5 days I shall meet you at the rendezvous on the southern coast and claim her as my share of the loot. Do this well, and that is all the share of loot I will ask at this time." "A mere detail," Barbados said. "If the hacienda is disturbed a bit during the abduction, it will not cause the heartbreak of the governor. This Don Carlos Pulido is no friend of His Excellency." "I understand, senor." "The senorita expects to become the bride tomorrow of Don Diego Vega. Curse him. That large house at the side of the plaza is his. When you're raiding the town, Barbados, pay special attention to that house, and should he get a knife between his ribs, there will be no sorrow on my part." "I begin to comprehend," Barbados replied. "I may depend on you?" "Si, senor. We attend to the house of this Don Diego Vega and to the Don personally. I shall send a small force to abduct the girl and take her to shore. She will be waiting for you at the rendezvous to the south. Good. Watch when the soldiers ride away and strike an hour later. Adios. The cloak dropped for a moment as the man from the village straightened himself. Barbados got a good look at his face as the moonlight struck it. He gasped. Your forehead, he said. It's nothing. That cursed beast of a Zorro put it there. Barbados looked again. On the man's forehead was a ragged Z put there in such a manner that it would remain forever. There was a moment of silence, and Barbados found himself alone. The other had slipped away through the shadows. Barbados grinned. Here's a double deal of some sort, but it need bring me no fear. He is mused. Here would be startling news for all men to know. Wants to steal a girl now, does he? For his share of proper loot, I'd steal 6 girls. He grinned again and started back towards his men. Barbados did not fear the soldiers, and he knew they would be sent away. He could be sure of that, for the conspirator who had come to him out of the dark was none other than Captain Ramon, Commandante of the Presidio at Reina de los Angeles. Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez, a giant of a wine-guzzling soldier whose heart was as large as his capacity for liquor, was known as Pedro the Boaster. When there were military duties to be done, he was to be found at his post in the Presidio, but at other times one found him at the village posada, sitting before the big fireplace and remaking the world in his words. On this moonlight night, Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez crossed the plaza with a corporal and a couple of soldiers, entered the inn, and called in a loud voice for the landlord to fetch wine and be quick about it. The sergeant had learned long since that the fat landlord held him in terror, and did but act surly and displeased, he received excellent service. "Landlord, you're as fat as your wine is thin," Sergeant Pedro declared, sprawling at one of the tables. "I have a suspicion now and then that you keep a special wineskin for me and mix water with my drink." "Senor," the landlord protested, "we honest soldiers are stationed here to protect you from liars and thieves and dishonest travelers up and down the Camino Real, and you treat us like dirt beneath your boots." "Senor, I have the greatest respect." "One of these fine days," Gonzalez interrupted, "there will be trouble. Some gentleman of the highway will approach you with an idea of robbery, and you'll shriek for the soldiery. And then, fat one, I remember the watered wine and may be busy elsewhere." "But I protest," the landlord began. "More wine," the sergeant shouted. "Must I get out my blade and carve your wineskins or your own skin?" "More of the wine and your best, and you'll get your pay when I get mine. If it's an honest score you keep, if my friend Don Diego Vega was here." "That same friend of yours makes merry a little later in the evening," the landlord said as he went to fill the wine cups. "Tomorrow he's to take his bride." "Pig, do you suppose I don't know?" Gonzalez screeched. "Think you that I have been asleep the past few months? Was I not in the thick of it when Don Diego Vega played at being Senor Zorro?" "You're in the thick of it," the corporal admitted, with a touch of sarcasm in his voice. "Ha!" cried the sergeant. "There was a turbulent time for you. Here in this very room I fought him blade to blade, thinking that he was some stinking highwayman, and just as I was getting the better of it—" "How is this?" the corporal shrieked. "Just as I was getting to the better of the blade match," Gonzalez reaffirmed, glaring at the corporal. Back he went and dashed through the door, and thereafter he set the town about his own ears for some time to come. "It occurs to me that I saw that fight," the corporal declared. "If you're getting the best of it at any stage, then my eyes are at fault." "I know a man," said the sergeant darkly, "who will do an extra guard duty for a score of days." "Ha!" the corporal grunted. "Do you not like plain speech?" "I do not like a soldier to make mock of his superiors," the sergeant replied. It were unseemly for me to make remarks, for instance, concerning our Commandante, Captain Ramon, but let it be said that he fought this Senor Zorro too, and Captain Ramon wears on his forehead Zorro's mark. You will notice that there is no carved Z on my face. Ha, the corporal grunted again. It were best, Sergeant, to voice such remarks inwardly. The Commandante is not proud of the mark he wears. Gonzalez changed the subject. The wine, he thundered. It goes well on a moonlit night, the same as on a stormy one. But the moonlight is a poor business save for love-sick swains. 'Tis no night for a soldier. Would one expect thieves to descend through the moonlight? There be pirates, the corporal said. Pirates? Gonzalez's great fist descended and met the table with a crash, sending the wine cups bouncing. Pirates? You have noticed no pirates in Reina de los Angeles, have you? They've not been playing around the Presidio, have they? I'm not saying that they know I am stationed here, however. Meal, mush, and goat's milk. Pirates is my dish. The town grows wealthy, and they may come, the corporal said. You fear? You trembled? Gonzalez cried. Are you soldier or fray? Pirates, by the saints. I would that they came. My sword arm grows fat from little use. Talk not of pirates, the landlord begged. Suppose they did come. And if they did? Gonzalez demanded. Am I not here? Dolt? Are there not soldiers? Pirates? Ha! He sprang to his feet, for same feet spread wide apart. His hand darted down. He whipped out his blade. That for a pirate, he shouted, and made a mighty thrust towards the wall. This for a pirate, and he slashed through the air, his blade whistling so the corporal and soldiers sprang backward, and the 4 or 5 natives who happened to be in the inn cringed in the corner. Pirates, cried Gonzalez. I would, and I could meet them this very night. We grew stale from inaction. There's too much peace in the world. Meal, mush, and goat's milk. The door opened suddenly. Sergeant Gonzalez stopped in the middle of a sentence, and his blade stopped in the middle of an arc. And then the sergeant and the other soldiers snapped to attention, for the Commandante was before them. Sergeant Gonzalez, Captain Ramon commanded. See. I could hear you shouting halfway across the plaza. If you wish to meet a pirate, perhaps you may have your wish. Rumors have been brought by the natives. Mount your men and proceed along the El Camino Real toward the south. Search the country well. Once you are 4 or 5 miles from town, it is a bright moonlit night, and men may see a great distance. It's an order, the sergeant admitted. Leave but 1 man at the Presidio as guard. Return before dawn. Have my best horse made ready as I ride out to the hacienda for a visit. Now go. Si, Senor, Gonzalez grunted. He motioned to the soldiers, and they hurried through the door. He sheathed his sword, and when the back of the Captain Ramon was turned for an instant, he tossed off the wine that had been before him and hurried after his men. The Commandante drew off his gloves and sat at one of the tables. Gonzalez led the way across the plaza toward the Presidio. He was growling low down his throat. This is a fine state of affairs, he said. Ride all night and kick up dust, back before dawn with nothing done. But you wanted pirates, the corporal protested. Think you they will stand in the middle of El Camino Real and await our pleasure? Gonzalez growled. What pirate would be aboard on a night like this? Could we but meet some? Ha! There's a special reward for pirates. Even before they'd reached the entrance of the Presidio, he began shouting his orders. Torches flared, and men ran to prepare horses. 15 minutes later, with Gonzalez at their head, they rode across the plaza and upon the El Camino Real, their mounts snorting, their sabers rattling. From the crest of the slope, a few hundred yards away, Barbados and his evil crew watched them depart on their mounts. While the blushes played across her cheeks, Senorita Lolito Pulido sat at one end of the big table in the great living room of her father's house and watched the final preparations for her wedding. Don Carlos, her gray-haired father, watched proudly from the foot of the table. Donna Catalina, her mother, walked majestically around the room and gave soft commands. Native servants scurried like rats in and out of the great room, carrying bundles of silk and satin gowns and intimate garments. Tomorrow, Don Carlos sighed, and in the sigh was that which spoke of cruelties bravely borne. Tomorrow, senorita, you become the bride of Don Diego Vega and the first lady of Reina de los Angeles, and my troubles, let us hope, are at an end. Let us hope so, said Donna Catalina. The governor himself dare not raise his hand against the father-in-law of Don Diego Vega. My fortunes will increase again, and you, daughter of my heart, will be a great lady, with wealth at your command. And love, also, the little senorita said, bowing her head. Love, also, said Donna Catalina. Ah, Don Carlos cried with a gale of laughter. It is love now, is it? And when first Don Diego came wooing, the girl would have none of him. Even to better the family fortune, he was dull, he yawned, and she wanted a man of hot blood and romantic. But when it was learned that he was Senor Zorro, that made a difference. Love, also. It is well. Senorita Lolita blushed again and fumbled at a soft garment upon her lap. There came a pounding at the door, and one of the servants opened it. Don Carlos glanced up to find a man of the village there. It is a message, senor? He asked. From whom? Don Carlos asked. From Don Diego Vega to the little senorita. Senorita Lolita dimpled, and her black eyes flashed as she bent over the heap of garments again. Don Carlos stood up and stalked majestically towards the door. I take the message, he said, and he took it and handed it to Donna Catalina, that she might read it first. Don Diego Vega is not wed to my daughter as yet. It is proper that he send her sealed message. His eyes were twinkling as he turned away. Senorita Lolita pouted and pretended indifference, and Donna Catalina, her mother, unfolded the message and read it with a smile on her lips. It is harmless, she announced. Senorita Lolita looked up and took the message from her mother's hand. Don Diego Vega, it appeared, wasted no words. His message was read swiftly. This man has orders to make a record carrying this greeting of love to you and fetching yours in return. Thine, Diego. Ha! Don Carlos shouted. Economy is a great thing, but not in words when there is love to be spoken. You should have seen the messages I sent Catalina in the old days. Carlos, Donna Catalina warned, and paid a native wench royally to slip them to her. Don Carlos continued shamelessly. Behind the back of her dueña, page after page, and every word a labor. I could fight better than I could write. Perhaps so, Don Diego, the little senorita said. Staunch and loyal to him, are you? Don Carlos roared. That is proper. Pen your reply, my daughter, and let this man establish his record for return trip to Reina de los Angeles. Do not keep Don Diego waiting. The senorita blushed again, got up, and swept into a room adjourning. Don Carlos addressed the messenger. How are things in town? Don Diego entertains his caballero friends at the last bachelor supper, senor, the man replied. Ha, young men, I suppose. Si, senor. Wine flows, I take it, and the table is piled high with rich food. Si, senor. Ah, well, I shall have my turn tomorrow at the marriage feast, Don Carlos said. My regards to Don Diego Vega. They shall be given to him, senor. The senorita returned and handed what she had written to her mother, who perused it and sealed it and handed it to the messenger in turn. The man bobbed his head respectfully in salute and hurried out. Native servant closed the door behind him, but neglected to drop the heavy bar in place because of the unusual excitement and unnoticed. Don Carlos resumed his position at the foot of the table. This was a great night for him, and tomorrow would be a great day. He was happy because his fortunes were on the mend, because the governor had been forced to cease his persecutions, but he was happy also because his daughter was to have happiness. Don Carlos and his wife had lavished upon this, their only child, love enough for a dozen, and now both glanced at her as she fumbled at a silken shawl. Her black eyes were sparkling again, though dreams were glistening in them. Her cheeks were delicately flushed, her dainty hands played with the silks. One tiny tip of a boot peeped from beneath the voluminous skirts, and bride of whom any man could honestly be proud, Don Carlos thought, and with proper blood in her veins and proper thoughts in her head. So Don Diego makes merry tonight with his young friends, Don Carlos said. I would like to peer in upon him now. Could he have done so, he would have seen merry gathering. In the big living room of Don Diego's town casa, a huge table had been spread. Don Diego sat at the head of it, dressed in fastidious garments, and caballeros were grouped around it. Richly dressed they were, with blades at their side, blades with jeweled hilts, but serviceable weapons for all that. Wine cups and dishes were for them. They feasted and they drank. They toasted Don Diego and the Senorita Lolita, Don Diego's father and the Senorita's father, and one other. Another good man gone wrong, cried Don Andre Ruiz. He sat at Don Diego's right hand because he was Don Diego's closest friend. Here is our comrade, Don Diego, about to turn into a family man, he continued. This scion of old Spain, this delicate morsel of caballero blood to be gobbled up by the monster of matrimony. It's time to weep. Into your wine cup, Don Diego added. Ha, Don Andre Ruiz cried. But a few days ago, it seems, we rode after him as though he had been the devil, rode hard upon his heels, thinking that we're following some sort of renegade caballero playing highwayman. Senor Zorro, by the saints, we shouted praises of him because for a time he took us out of our monotony. Then came the unmasking, and we found that Don Diego and Senor Zorro were one and the same. He ceased speaking long enough to empty his wine cup and make certain that a servant refilled it. Senor Zorro, he continued, those are happy moments, and now he is to turn husband and no more riding abroad with sword in hand. We shall die of monotony, Diego, my friend. Oh, fat, Don Diego corrected. What has become of the wild blood that coursed through your veins for a few moons? Don Andre Ruiz demanded. Where are those precious turbulent drops that were in Zorro? They linger, Don Diego declared. It needs but the cause to turn them into active being. Ha! A cause, caballeros. Let us find him a cause that is. This good friend of ours will be too busy to get married. One moment, Don Diego cried. He stood up and smiled at them, gave a little twitch of his shoulders, and turned his back upon the brilliant company and hurried from the room. They drank again and waited. After a time he came back, silk drape bundled beneath one arm. What mystery is this? Don Andre demanded. He sprawled back in the chair and prepared to laugh. It was said of Don Andre that he was always prepared to laugh. He laughed when he made love, when he fought, as he ate and drank, his bubbling spirit always upon his lips. Here is no mystery, Don Diego Vega declared. He smiled at them, unwrapped what he held, and suddenly exhibited a sword. The blade of Zorro, he cried. There was an instant of silence, and then every caballero sprang to his feet. Their own swords came flashing from their scabbards, flashed on high, reflected in a million rays of glowing lights of the candelabra. Zorro, they shouted, Zorro! Good old blade, Don Diego said, a whimsical smile playing about his lips. Good old point, exclaimed Don Andre Ruiz. With it you marked many a scoundrel with your mark, notably and especially one Captain Ramon. Why do we endure his presence here in Reina de los Angeles? Why not force the governor to send him north? Let us not mar a perfect evening with thoughts of him, Don Diego begged. Caballeros, I have brought this blade before you for a purpose. We have drunk toasts to everything which we could think, and there still remains an abundance of rare wine that has not been guzzled. A toast to the sword of Zorro." "Ha! A happy thought," Don Andre Ruiz cried. "Caballeros, a toast to the sword of Zorro." They drank it, put down their golden goblets, and sighed. They glanced at each other, and thinking of the days when Zorro had ruled the El Camino Real for a time, and then they dropped into their chairs once more, and Don Diego Vega sat down also, the sword on the table before him. "It was a great game," he said, and sighed himself, "but it is in the past. Now I shall be a man of peace and quiet." "That remains to be seen," Don Andre declared. "There may be domestic warfare, you know. A man takes terrible chance when he weds." "Nothing but peace and quiet," Don Diego responded. "The sword of Zorro is but a relic. Years from now I may look upon it and smile. It served its purpose." He yawned. "By the saints," Don Andre Ruiz breathed. "Did you see him?" He yawned. While yet the word Zorro was upon his lips, he yawned. "And this is the man who defended and persecuted priests and natives and defied the soldiery and made the governor go do a dance. 'Tis a cause he wants and needs, something to change him into Zorro again." "Tomorrow I become a husband," Don Diego answered him, yawning yet once more and fumbling with a handkerchief. "By the way, senors, have you ever seen this one?" He spread the handkerchief over the wine goblet before him, and the caballeros bent forward to watch, smiles upon their faces. He passed one hand rapidly back and forth upon the covered goblet with such rapidity that it was hidden almost all the time, and with the other hand he reached beneath the edge of the handkerchief and jerked the goblet away, letting it drop to the floor. The handkerchief collapsed on the table. Don Diego waved a hand languidly, and "See, it's gone," he breathed. "Bah!" Don Andre cried as the others laughed. "At your boy's tricks again, are you? Where is your wild blood now?" "I am done roistering an adventure. A man never knows when his words will be hurled back at him and cause him to look foolish," said Don Andre. "It is foolish to take everything for granted. For instance," he stopped. The sounds of tumult had reached their ears. For a moment they were silent, listening, shouts, oaths, the sounds of blows and clashing blades. "What in the name of saints is that?" Don Diego asked. A trembling servant asked him. "There are men fighting over by the inn, senor. I heard someone shout of pirates." Barbados continued to mutter curses as he watched the sky. Not a cloud marred his face, and the moon was at its full. But here was an enterprise where there was small risk, so he could discount the bright light. He grunted his pleasure as he saw Sergeant Gonzalez and his troopers ride away from the Presidio, cross the plaza, and continue toward the south. He called Sanchez to him and explained what was to be done at the hacienda of Don Carlos Pulido. "You'll take half a dozen men," Barbados commanded. "Do as you please at the place, but capture the senorita by all means, and go quickly back over the hills to the mouth of the canyon, steal horses and ride. Get there before the break of day. We shall do the same, and the ship will be putting in at dawn or before." "Si," Sanchez replied. "And do you care for my share of the loot here? There may be small profit at the hacienda." Sanchez selected his ruffians and led them away around the hill and towards the north, where the hacienda of Don Carlos Pulido rested. Barbados whispered instructions to the remainder of the crew. And then they waited, for Barbados wished to make sure that the soldiers did not return. For more than an hour longer he waited, and then gave the word. Down the crest of the slope they slipped, breathing heavily, lusting for illegal gain, holding their cutlasses in readiness for instant use. They kept in the scant shadows as much as possible, scattered as they crossed the wider light places, and made their way slowly to the edge of town. There, in the shadows cast by an empty adobe building, they separated, and Barbados whispered his final instructions. They were to look for the rich loot and nothing bulky, He had decided against food and wine, bolts of cloth and casks of olives and jars of honey. Such things could be obtained later at any hacienda. Just now he wished to get portable values and hurry back to the coast. Men were detailed to seize horses and have them in readiness. Certain large houses were to be attacked in force after the smaller ones had been disposed of. The inn was to receive special attention, since it was whispered that the fat landlord had hidden wealth. Down upon the town they crept, and suddenly they charged into the plaza from either side. Into the inn they poured, and cutting and slashing at natives until they fled, screeching with terror, stabbing at the fat landlord as he called upon the saints. They took what the landlord had and gave their attention to the houses and shops, and now bedlam broke loose as it was realized what was taking place. Doors were smashed, terrified men and women were driven from room to room, things of value were seized, jewels were ripped off dainty throats and delicate fingers, silken shawls were torn from beautiful shoulders. Here and there a man gave fight, but not for long. The pirates outnumbered the citizen, because they traveled in force and the citizens were scattered. Shrieks and screeches and cries stabbed the air. Raucous oaths and fiendish laughter rang across the plaza, and above the din roared the voice of Barbados, the human fiend, as he ordered his men, commanded them, admonished men, led them to an easy victory. It was quick work, because the descent had been so unexpected. It might have continued through the night until the town was stripped bare, until not a native's hut was left standing, but Barbados wanted quick loot and a getaway. He wanted to reach the coast during the bright moonlight, get the planks of the ship's deck beneath his feet once more. He trusted Captain Ramon, but he feared that the soldiers might return. Across the plaza the pirates charged, with Barbados at their lead. They broke into the church. They filled the sacred edifice with oaths and ribald jest and raucous laughter. They darted here and there, torches held high above their heads, searching for articles of worth. From a little room to one side stepped a Fray. His hair was silver, his face was calm, erect and purposeful he stood, looking across them. Quick steps forward he took toward the altar where there were relics that he loved. "What do you hear, senores?" he demanded. His voice seemed soft, yet at the same time there was a ring of steel in it. They stopped, their shouting ceased. There was a moment of silence. "Who are you?" one shouted. "I am called Fray Felipe, senores," came the response. "Just now I am in charge of this house of worship. How is it that you so far forget yourself as to bring your tumult in here?" "Fray," one shouted. "Fool and Fray? Why do you bring your tumult in here? For to get loot?" "Loot?" Fray Felipe thundered, taking another step forward. "You would profane this house? You would lay sacrilegious hands on what is to be found here, even as you have voiced sacrilegious tones within these walls? Scum of the earth, be gone!" They surged toward him. "One side, Fray," shouted a foremost one. "Respect the black flag, and we respect your ground." "Spawn of hell, sons of the devil," Fray Felipe thundered. "Back to the door and out of this holy place." He scarcely hoped to stop them. There were rich ornaments on the altar, and in the uncertain light the torches shed he could see the eyes of the nearest glittering, and the gem-studded goblet was there. Thought of the gem-studded goblet gave new strength to the ancient Fray Felipe. It was a relic highly prized. Fray Felipe loved it and cared for it tenderly. There was a legend connected with it. Once it had been touched by a saint's lips, men had said. To have this scum as much as touch the sacred goblet was too much. To have them steal it would be unthinkable. Once more they surged forward, and Fray Felipe sprang before the altar and threw up his hands in a gesture of command. "Back!" he cried. "Would you damn beyond recovery your immortal souls? Would you commit the unpardonable sin?" "Ha!" shouted a man in front of the throng. "Worry not about our souls, Fray. One side, else you have a chance to worry about the state of your own. We have scant time to spend on a fray." "What will you Fray Felipe asked. Loot, fool of a Fray. Only over my dead body do you take it. I'm not afraid to die to protect holy things. But you will fear to die if you do this thing. Slit his throat, cried one in the throng. Are we here to argue? The work is not done. Once more they surged forward. The light of the torches sent rays of fire shooting through the ornaments on the altar. Their lust for loot consumed them. Fray Felipe braced himself, seized the nearest, raised him half from the floor, and hurled him back against his fellows. The Fray shows fight, one cried. Use your knives, you in the front, a stab between the ribs, and let us go. Again they rushed, and Fray Felipe prepared for one more feeble attempt, the one he deemed would be his last. He made the sign of the cross and waited calmly, waited until they were upon him, until he could feel their hot breathing upon his face, until the stench of their perspiration was in his nostrils. But even as the man raised his cutlass to strike, there came an interruption. The bellowing voice of Barbados rang out above the din. Stop, he shrieked. There was something terrifying in the sudden, unexpected command. The pirates stopped, fell back. Barbados charged through them into Fray Felipe's side. The pirate's face showed white in the light of the torches. Back, he commanded. This Fray is not to be harmed. Out, you fools, devils. There's one rich house yet to be robbed. Let us not tarry here. There is loot, one began. He did not complete his sentence. Barbados whirled, and with a single blow he stretched him out senseless. Out, he commanded. This Fray is not to be touched. They backed away from him, rushed back to gather near the door. They did not pretend to understand this, but Barbados was the chief, and perhaps he knew what he was doing. They saw him turn, knew that he spoke to the Fray, but he could not make out his words. I had nothing to do with this, Barbados said. I assault no Fray nor priest. I stopped them in time. Had I not remained outside a moment to watch affairs, I would have stopped them before. You're not wholly bad, Fray Felipe said. I am wholly bad, Fray. Make no mistake about it, but I keep my hands off Frays and priests. He whirled around and rushed to the door, shrieking at his men. Only the soft light of the candles glowed in the church. Fray Felipe took a step forward and looked after them. He turned toward the altar, a look of thankfulness on his face, and then suddenly the look changed. Misery took its place. Fray Felipe gave a little cry of mingled surprise and pain and tottered forward. The precious gem-studded goblet was gone. He sensed at once how it happened. When they had charged upon him before Barbados came, one of the pirates had snatched the goblet away. Fray Felipe whirled toward the door again, took half a dozen steps, seemed at the point of rushing after them. But he knew they were on the other side of the plaza now, that an appeal to them would be useless. However, he could try. He faced the altar again. The expression of his old countenance was wonderful to see. And then there Felipe took a vow. I go, he said. I return with the saintly goblet, or do not return at all. Barbados had saved the casa of Don Diego Vega for the last. He kept an eye upon it, however, while his men were looting the town, but had seen nothing to indicate danger from that quarter. And now he remembered Captain Ramon's commands, and it pleased him to carry them out. Don Diego's was the finest house in the village and seemed to promise much rich loot. Barbados placed 4 of his men outside to guard against the unexpected return of soldiers and led the remainder straight through the front door. They hesitated there for a moment, gathered closely together, then Barbados gave the word and they rushed through the door and hurled themselves inside to go sprawling over the rich rugs and carpets and stopped in astonishment and confusion. Barbados swore a great oath as he strove to maintain his balance. Before them was a wonderful room, lavishly furnished. To one side was a wide stairway that led to the upper regions of the house, and priceless tapestries were hanging from the mezzanine. But what engaged the attention of Barbados and his crew was the big table in the middle of the room, and a score of some richly dressed caballeros sitting around it. Here was the unexpected, which Barbados always feared. He came to a stop, thrust forward his head, and his little eyes began glittering. The soldiers were gone from the town, but here were a score of young caballeros who were fully as good as soldiers in a fight and who loved fighting. Barbados had seen such young blades and handle swords and rapiers before. The entrance of the pirates had followed closely upon the announcement of their presence in the town to Don Diego by the servant, and when they tumbled through the door, showing their evil faces in the strong light, the caballeros struggled to get to their feet, reaching for their blades. The smiles swept from their faces, and expressions of grim determination showing there instead. But the calm voice of Don Diego quieted them. "Ha," Don Diego said. "What have we here, senores? It is the night before my wedding, and most persons are welcome to partake of my hospitality. But this happens to be a select gathering of my close friends, and I really cannot remember having sent you invitations." "Have done," Barbados bellowed, his voice ringing with a courage he scarcely felt. "Have done, fashionable fop. We are men who sail under the black flag, terrible alike on land and sea." Don Diego Vega threw back his head and laughed lightly. "Did you hear that, Audrey, my friend?" he asked Ruiz. "This fellow says that he and his comrades are terrible alike on land and sea." Don Andre entered into the spirit of the occasion as he always did. "Diego, I did not know that you had such wit," he said. "Have you hired these fellows to come here and give us fright? Ha! What a merry jest! One that I'll remember to my last day. For a moment I was ready to draw a blade." "Jest, is it?" Barbados cried, lurching forward almost to the foot of the table. "'Twill be considered no jest when we have stripped you of your jewels and playthings, swords, and this house of what valuables it contains. Back up against the wall, senores, and the man who makes a rash move will not live to make another." "I have made a multitudes of rash moves, and I still live," Audrey Ruiz told him. "Diego, it is indeed an excellent jest. I give you my thanks." "Pirates," Don Diego said, laughing again. "In reality, I did not hire them to come here and furnish us with this entertainment. But since they have been so kind, it is no more than right that I pay them." He sprang to his feet, bent forward with his hands upon the table, and glared down the length of it at Barbados. "You are the chief bull pirate?" he asked. "I am the king of the crew," Barbados replied. "Back against the wall, you and your friends." Don Diego Vega laughed lightly again, and the laughter fled his face, and his eyes narrowed, and he seemed to send forth flakes of steel. "See, you must be paid," he said, "but there are many ways of making payment." The sword of Senor Zorro was beneath his hands, and suddenly it was out of the scabbard, and he sprang upon the table and dashed down the full length of it, scattering goblets and plates of drink and food. Off the other end he sprang and struck the floor a few feet in front of Barbados, who had recoiled and was struggling to get his cutlass out of his belt. The sword of Zorro flashed through the air, describing a gleaming arc. "Pirate, eh?" Don Diego Vega cried. "You have come to collect riches, have you, Senor Pirate?" "What is to prevent us?" Barbados sneered. "You and your pretty toy of a sword." "Ha! You insult a good blade," Don Diego cried. "That insult shall not go unpunished. Look you here." Don Diego Vega whirled suddenly to one side. His sword seemed to flash fire, and its point bit into the panel in the wall once, twice, thrice. Barbados looked in amazement, his lower jaw sagging. His eyes bulged, and he looked again. Scratched on the panel of the wall was a Z. "That mark!" the pirate gasped. You are Zorro." "That mark, the same the Commandante wears on his forehead." Don Diego had whirled to face him again. "How know you there's such a mark on the forehead of Captain Ramon?" he demanded. "So, the Commandante deals with pirates, does he?" "That is how it happens that my friend Sergeant Gonzalez and his soldiers are not here. Ha!" Barbados blustered forward, his cutlass held ready, striving to regain the mastery of the situation. "Give us loot or we attack," he thundered. "Attack? Fool!" Don Diego cried. Do you imagine that you hold the upper hand here? Up with your blade. The last thing Barbados wished to do was to fight a caballero under such circumstances. He had the fear of a mongrel for the thoroughbred, but here was a thing that could not be avoided unless his leadership of the pirates suffer. The caballeros sprang from their chairs, drawing their swords, shouting in keen anticipation of a break in the deadly monotony of their lives. They rushed to the right and to the left and engaged the pirates as they rushed forward. Don Diego Vega found himself at liberty to engage Barbados only, a thing he relished and which he did with right good will. Barbados fought like a fiend, mouthing curses, puffing out his cheek, but he did not understand this style of fighting. Don Diego Vega seemed to be wielding half a dozen blades that sang about his head and threatened to bury themselves in his throat. His cutlass seemed heavy, useless as his strokes went wild. Back toward the wall went Barbados, while Don Diego grinned at him and taunted him, played with him as a cat does with a mouse. "Pirate, eh?" Don Diego said. "Terrible on either land or sea." "'Tis a jest, Senor Pirate, a thin jest." Barbados sensed the termination of his combat was not to be to his liking. He got a chance to glance once around the big room. What he saw staggered him. Two of the caballeros were stretched on the floor, blood flowing from their wounds, but aside from those two, the caballeros were getting much the better of the combat. The pirates were retreating toward the front door. Their heavy cutlasses were of no avail against the flaming, darting light swords, especially when the men who handled those swords refused to stand to be cut down, but danced here and there like phantoms. But Barbados did not have time to contemplate that scene long. Don Diego Vega pressed his attack. Back against the wall went the pirate chief. He crouched, fought his best, but suddenly felt a twinge of pain in his wrist, and his cutlass left his hand and shot through the air to fall with a crash in the corner. Barbados stared stupidly before him and then came alive to his immediate peril, for Don Diego Vega was standing before him, smiling a smile that was not good to see. "Payment shall be made," Don Diego said. His blade darted up and forward, and Barbados gave a little cry of pain and fear and recoiled. On his forehead, it seemed, was a streak of fire. Again the sword of Zorro darted forth, and there was a second streak of fire, and then a third. And then Don Diego Vega took a step backward and bowed mockingly. "You wear my brand," he said. "It is an honor." Terror had claimed Barbados for the moment. Now he slipped a short distance along the wall while Diego followed him, and suddenly he shrieked his commands and darted toward the door. Into the plaza tumbled the pirates, the caballeros at their heels. Barbados shrieked more commands, and the pirates ran with what speed they had. Those left behind in the plaza gathered the horses they needed and the loot, and those coming from the castle of Don Diego rushed toward the horses now. For the greater part of those horses were fine, blooded stock and belonged to Don Diego's guests, mounts used to traveling at rapid rate of speed between some hacienda and the town. Barbados urged his men to haste. Only compact loot could be carried. They sprang to the backs of the horses and dashed away. The caballeros pursued on foot until the plaza had been crossed, and they stopped and gathered around Don Diego. "There can be no pursuit," Diego said. "They have made away with your horses. My friends, those soldiers are not here, and the only mounts remaining in town are not fit for caballeros to ride." "Yet they must be pursued," said a voice at his side. Don Diego whirled to find ancient Fray Felipe standing there. "They have stolen the sacred goblet," Fray Felipe said in a calm voice. "I have taken a vow to regain it." "The goblet!" Diego gasped. "Don Diego, my friend, you will help me with this," Fray Felipe asked. "I have known you since you were a babe in arms. I have loved you. Tomorrow I wed," Don Diego said. "But I shall do everything in my power. We'll get horses as soon as possible and pursue. I'll open my purse, and up and down the El Camino Real men will go, seeking where these pirates touch shore again. We'll get the goblet." "I have more faith in your sword arm than in your purse, my friend," Felipe said, "but Do what you can." The caballeros had gathered now. Men and women were pouring from the houses, telling of what had befallen them. Barbados and his men had been merciful for pirates. They had taken wealth, but they had taken very few lives. Don Diego Vega started back across the plaza toward his house, his friends around him. "For a moment, I was Senor Zorro again," he said. "Those drops of blood you mentioned grew hot for a time, Audrey, my friend." "Glorious," Audrey Ruiz breathed. "I would. We had horses, and could follow them, even a ship to follow them out to sea. Don Diego, my friend, your bachelor supper is a great success." "Then let us return and conclude it," Don Diego said. "We have a couple of wounded friends in the house. Let us attend to them." "Let us bathe their wounds in wine," Audrey suggested. They hurried into the house. The frightened servants came forward again and began putting things to rights. The two wounded caballeros were in the chairs already, men working to bandage them. Once more Don Diego sat at the head of the table, and the caballeros dropped into their chairs, and the servants made haste to fill the goblets. Don Diego put the sword of Zorro on the table before him and promised that they toasted again. There came a sudden commotion at the door, and a man stumbled in. Don Diego was on his feet instantly, for he knew the man. He was leading workmen at the hacienda of Don Carlos Pulido. A horrible fear gripped Don Diego's heart. The man was exhausted. He staggered forward and would have fallen had not Don Diego grasped him and braced him against the corner of the table. "Senor," he gasped. "Don Diego, young master, speak." "Pirates attacked the hacienda more than an hour ago, while others were attacking here." "Tell it quickly." "Don Carlos is sorely wounded, senor. Many of the buildings are burned. The house was looted." "The senorita?" Don Diego questioned. "Do not strike me when I speak, young master. Speak." "They carried away the senorita. They slew 6 who would have saved her." "Carried her away?" Don Diego cried. "Toward the sea," the man gasped. "I heard one of the pirates shout that she was to be treated gently, that she was to be the prize of some great man." Don Diego Vega tossed him aside, and once more the blade of Zorro was in his hand. His friends were upon their feet and crowding forward. "A rescue!" Don Audrey Ruiz cried. "We must save the senorita." "They have stolen the bride of Don Diego. The fools!" another shouted. "Worse than that for them," Audrey screeched. "They have stolen the bride of Zorro." Don Diego Vega seemed to recover from the shock. "You're right, my friends," he cried. "This is touch enough to turn my blood hot again. Don Diego Vega is dead for a time. Senor Zorro takes to the trail. Audrey, give me the best horse you can. You others, wait." He dashed up the stairs. Audrey hurried through the front door. The others waited, talking wildly of plans for reaching the shore of the sea. Frightened servants stood about as though speechless. In a short space of time, Don Diego returned to them, but he was Don Diego no longer. Now he wore the costume he had worn when he was Senor Zorro. He had ridden up and down the length of the El Camino Real, and in his face was a light that was not good to see. Don Audrey hurried in. "I've got one good horse," he said. "I go," Don Diego cried. "I follow them to the sea. The 2 forces will meet me there." "We are with you in this," Don Audrey cried. "With you as when you were Zorro before. With you, my friend, until we have the little senorita safe again." Their naked blades flashed overhead in a token of allegiance. Don Diego thanked them with a look. "Then follow me to the sea," he cried. "A trading ship is due there in the morning. Mayhap we'll have to take it and trace them across the waves. I go. Zorro takes to the trail." He dashed to the door, the others following. He sprang into the saddle of the mount Don Audrey had procured. He drove home the spurs cruelly and rode like a demon through the bright moonlight and up the slope, then taking the shortest trail to the sea.